Life has a funny way of teaching us the most important lessons when we least expect them. This story begins with a man who had climbed his way to the top through years of hard work and determination. As the owner of one of the country's most prestigious hotel chains, he had everything money could buy: luxury cars, a penthouse overlooking the city, and respect in the business world. But something was bothering him lately. It started with a simple notification on his phone. While scrolling through his hotel's review pages late one night, he noticed a pattern that made his stomach turn. Several guests had reported unfair treatment, with some mentioning they felt discriminated against because of their appearance or the color of their skin. The reviews weren't just at one location. They were spread across different branches of his hotel chain. For someone who had faced similar prejudices on his journey to success, these reviews hit close to home. He remembered the days when people would look at him differently when he walked into high-end stores or restaurants. Even now, when he wasn't wearing his expensive suits, he sometimes noticed how people's attitudes would change. Instead of just firing off angry emails or delegating the problem to his HR department, he sat in his office, looking out at the city lights, and came up with a different plan. He knew from experience that sometimes the only way to understand a problem was to see it firsthand. His mind wandered back to his early days, before success, before the money, when he had to prove himself twice as hard as everyone else. The next morning, he called a trusted friend who worked in theater makeup. "I need your help with something unusual," he explained, pacing around his office. "I want to see how my hotels really treat people who don't look like they belong." His friend listened carefully as he laid out his plan to go undercover in his own hotels. This wasn't just about catching bad employees, it was about understanding the root of the problem. He thought about his parents who had taught him to judge people by their character, not their appearance. They had run a small convenience store, treating every customer with the same respect, whether they paid with crisp bills or counted out pennies. As he planned his undercover visit, he felt a mix of emotions. There was anxiety about what he might discover, determination to make things right, and a strange excitement about stepping out of his comfortable world. He knew this investigation could potentially damage his hotel's reputation if word got out, but doing nothing would be worse. He spent hours researching how other companies had handled similar situations, making notes on his laptop late into the night. He wanted to approach this carefully, not just to catch people doing wrong, but to create real, lasting change. This wasn't about revenge or public shaming. It was about making his hotels truly welcoming for everyone. In the days leading up to his undercover operation, he found himself paying more attention to the invisible people in his daily life. The cleaning staff in his office building, the delivery person dropping off packages, the elderly man who sat on the bench outside his favorite coffee shop. He realized how easy it was to look past people when you're caught up in your own world. As he prepared for what would become one of the most eye-opening experiences of his life, he couldn't help but think about how success had given him a platform to make real change. Now, it was time to use that platform to make sure everyone who walked through his hotel doors was treated with the dignity they deserved, regardless of what they wore or how they looked. The transformation began early on a Tuesday morning in a small makeup studio tucked away in the city's theater district. The owner of the hotel chain sat quietly in the chair, watching in the mirror as his appearance slowly changed. The makeup artist, an old friend from his community theater days, worked carefully to make the changes look natural and believable. "You know," his friend said, while applying subtle touches to age his skin, "this reminds me of those old movies where the boss goes undercover to learn about their company." They both chuckled, but there was a serious undertone to their laughter. This wasn't a movie. This was real life, with real consequences. The process took several hours. They started by slightly changing his facial features with professional theater makeup techniques. His normally well-maintained appearance was transformed with expertise. His skin made to look weathered, his clean-shaven face now showing patches of stubble. The changes were subtle but effective. Next came the clothing. He had visited several thrift stores the day before, carefully selecting items that looked worn but clean. A faded navy jacket with frayed cuffs, shoes that had seen better days, and pants that hung a bit loose. Every piece was chosen to tell a story of someone going through hard times but trying to maintain their dignity. As he put on each item of clothing, he thought about how appearances shape the way people treat each other. He remembered a story his grandmother used to tell about judging books by their covers, and how the most valuable lessons often come from unexpected sources. The clothes felt foreign on his skin, so different from his usual tailored suits. Standing in front of the full-length mirror, he barely recognized himself. His usual confident stance had been replaced by a slightly hunched posture they had practiced. Even his walk was different now, less purposeful, more hesitant. He had studied people at bus stops and in park benches, learning how to move like someone who's used to being invisible to the world. The key is to believe it yourself, his friend advised while making final adjustments. You're not playing a character, you're stepping into someone else's life for a while. They had spent time developing a backstory. A former office worker who'd fallen on hard times after a series of setbacks. It was a story that could happen to anyone, and that was exactly the point. To make the disguise even more convincing, they added small details that most people wouldn't notice but made the whole picture more authentic. His friend helped him practice different ways of speaking. Not dramatically different, just slightly more hesitant, like someone who had lost some confidence but not their self-respect. The final touch was the most important, learning to carry himself differently. They practiced in the studio, with his friend recording short videos so he could see how he looked from different angles. Remember, his friend said, you're not trying to fool anyone. You're just trying to understand. As the afternoon wore on, they went through several trial runs. He practiced entering rooms, asking for directions, and handling different situations he might encounter. Each time, his friend would give feedback, helping him adjust his mannerisms to be more authentic and less theatrical. By the time they finished, the sun was setting. Looking in the mirror one last time, he felt a mix of emotions. There was nervousness about what he might discover, but also a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just about catching discriminatory behavior, it was about understanding how it feels to walk in someone else's shoes. Before leaving the studio, his friend gave him a final piece of advice. Just remember, every person you meet has their own story. Some are just better hidden than others. With those words in mind, he stepped out onto the street, ready to begin an experience that would change not just his hotels, but his entire perspective on how people treat each other. The evening sky had turned dark and gloomy, with heavy rain clouds gathering overhead. It was the perfect weather for what he was about to do. As raindrops began to fall, he made his way to his flagship hotel, the crown jewel of his business empire. But tonight, he wasn't walking through the employee entrance or parking his luxury car in his reserved spot. Instead, he approached the grand entrance like any other person seeking shelter from the storm. The hotel's golden lights reflected in the puddles forming on the sidewalk, making the building look even more impressive than usual. He walked through these doors hundreds of times before, but never quite like this. His heart was beating faster than he expected as he pushed open the heavy glass door, feeling the warm air rush out to meet him. The lobby was busy with the usual evening crowd. Business people with their rolling suitcases, tourists taking photos of the elaborate chandelier, and staff members hurrying about their duties. As he stepped inside, water dripping from his worn jacket onto the polished marble floor, he immediately noticed how people's eyes slid past him, as if he were invisible. He hadn't been standing there for more than a minute when he saw the hotel manager approaching. It was strange seeing his employee from this new perspective, someone he'd hired just 6 months ago. The manager's face wore an expression he'd never seen before, a mix of annoyance and disgust that made his stomach turn. "Sir," the manager said, his voice dripping with fake politeness, "I'm afraid you'll have to leave." There was no warmth in his tone, no attempt to help or understand. Just immediate judgment based on appearance. "I was hoping to inquire about a room," he replied softly, his voice carefully measured. He practiced this moment, but the reality felt much more intense. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows. The manager's laugh was sharp and cruel. "I doubt you could afford even our basic rooms," he said, looking down at the wet footprints on his pristine floor. "This is a luxury hotel, not a shelter." The words were like slaps, each one demonstrating exactly what he feared might be happening in his hotels. Other guests were starting to stare now, some with discomfort, others with a mix of curiosity and pity. A young couple nearby whispered to each other, their eyes darting between him and the manager. A bellhop had stopped pushing his cart to watch the scene unfold. "I understand that," he continued, still keeping his voice calm and dignified. "But I would like to know the rates, if possible." He reached into his pocket as if to check for a wallet, using the movement to subtly activate the phone in his pocket that was recording everything. The manager's face darkened. "Listen," he said, stepping closer and lowering his voice to a harsh whisper, "people like you are not welcome here. I don't care if it's raining. Get out before I call security." The prejudice in his voice was unmistakable now, no longer hidden behind a professional mask. He felt a wave of emotions. Anger at the blatant discrimination, sadness that this was happening in his own hotel, and a strange sense of validation that his suspicions had been correct. The security cameras above were capturing everything, just as he'd arranged, but the personal experience of being treated this way was something no video could fully convey. A small crowd had gathered now, though most people were pretending not to watch. The rain continued to pour outside, making the warmth and luxury of the lobby feel even more exclusionary. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, each person making their own judgments, forming their own stories about who he was and why he was there. In that moment, standing in his own hotel lobby being treated like an unwelcome intruder, he realized this experiment had already revealed more than he expected. But what happened next would shock everyone in that lobby, including the manager, who was about to learn a very important lesson about judging people by their appearance. The tension in the lobby was thick enough to cut with a knife. 2 security guards were already making their way over, their walkie-talkies crackling with static. The manager stood there with his arms crossed, a smug look of satisfaction on his face as he waited for them to remove this unwanted guest from his pristine lobby. "Before your security team arrives," the disguised owner said calmly, "I'd like to ask you something." His voice had changed ever so slightly, shifting back toward its natural tone. "How long have you worked in the hospitality industry?" The question seemed to catch the manager off guard. The manager's face twitched with annoyance. "I don't need to answer any questions from someone like you," he snapped, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A woman at the check-in desk stopped signing her paperwork to watch. An elderly couple paused near the elevator, their luggage forgotten at their feet. "Actually," the owner continued, reaching into his jacket pocket, "you do need to answer my questions." His hand emerged holding not a wallet, but a familiar employee ID card, his real one. The transformation in the manager's face was almost comical, like watching someone bite into what they thought was a sweet apple only to discover it was sour. "You see," he said, his posture straightening to its usual confident stance, "this is my hotel. All of this," he gestured to the grand lobby, "belongs to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Someone in the back of the gathering crowd gasped. The manager's face went through a series of rapid changes, from confusion to disbelief, then to horror as recognition finally dawned. The security guards, who had nearly reached them, stopped in their tracks. One of them recognized their boss immediately, despite the makeup and worn clothes. "Sir, I didn't," the manager stammered, his voice barely a whisper now. The color had drained from his face, and his hands, which had been so confidently crossed over his chest moments ago, were now trembling slightly at his sides. "Don't apologize yet," the owner said, holding up his hand. "We have a lot to discuss, but not here." His voice was calm but firm. The lobby had gone completely silent, everyone frozen in place, watching this scene unfold like a play. A young desk clerk, who had witnessed everything from behind the counter, had her hand over her mouth in shock. The bellhop who had stopped to watch earlier was now looking at his shoes, perhaps reflecting on times he might have judged guests himself. "I'd like you to call the head of HR and have them meet us in the conference room," the owner continued, his voice level but authoritative. "And please ask my assistant to join us as well." He turned to the security guards, who were still standing awkwardly nearby. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming, but I won't be needing your services after all." The manager looked like he might faint. "Right away, sir," he managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. His hands fumbled with his phone as he made the calls, nearly dropping it twice. As they waited, the owner looked around the lobby, at the guests who were still staring, at the staff members who had stopped their work to watch, at the rain still beating against the windows outside. This moment, he realized, would be talked about for years to come. But more importantly, it would be the catalyst for real change. A young family walking through the lobby caught his eye. Parents with two small children, looking tired from traveling. He thought about how many families had possibly been turned away from his hotels, judged before they could even speak. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The manager finished his calls and stood there, looking lost and small in his expensive suit. The owner caught a glimpse of their reflections in the lobby's polished marble floor. Two men, dressed so differently, but both human, both capable of learning and growing. What happened next would determine not just one man's future, but the future of every guest who would walk through these doors. The walk to the conference room felt like the longest journey in the world, especially for the manager who trailed behind his boss like a scolded child. The owner had removed the worn jacket, though traces of the theatrical makeup still showed on his face. Every employee they passed did a double take, word spreading through the hotel like wildfire about what had just happened in the lobby. Inside the conference room, the lights automatically flickered on, revealing the elegant space where countless business deals had been made. The owner took his usual seat at the head of the table, but somehow he looked different now, not just because of his disguise, but because of what he just experienced. The rain continued to tap against the floor-to-ceiling windows, creating a gentle backdrop to the intense situation. The head of HR arrived first, slightly out of breath from rushing up from her office. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, her boss in shabby clothes with makeup starting to fade, and the manager looking like he might be sick. The owner's assistant came in right after, carrying a laptop and trying to hide her shock at her boss's appearance. "Please, everyone sit down," the owner said, his voice gentle but firm. The manager sank into a chair, looking like he wanted to disappear into it. "What happened downstairs needs to be addressed, but not in the way you might expect." He pulled out his phone and played the recording he'd made. The manager's voice filled the room, his cruel words echoing off the walls. With each passing second, the manager seemed to shrink further into his chair. The HR director's face grew increasingly concerned as she listened. When the recording finished, silence filled the room. The owner leaned forward, placing his hands on the polished table. "I want to tell you about my grandfather," he said, surprising everyone. "He came to this country with nothing but hope and determination. He cleaned rooms in a hotel, much like this one, where people treated him exactly how you treated me today." The personal story caught everyone off guard. The manager looked up, really seeing his boss for the first time. The assistant wiped a tear from her eye, while the HR director listened intently, her notebook untouched in front of her. "He taught me that true hospitality means seeing the dignity in every person who walks through our doors," the owner continued. "Today, I didn't just see discrimination, I felt it. I experienced what some of our guests might have gone through. And it stops now." The manager finally found his voice, though it trembled slightly. "Sir, I understand if you want my resignation." His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, knuckles white with tension. The owner shook his head. That would be the easy way out, wouldn't it? Fire you, hire someone else, and pretend the problem is solved. But we both know it's not that simple. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain fall on the city below. Instead, I want you to be part of the solution. He turned back to face the room. This isn't just about you or this hotel. It's about changing how we see and treat people. All people. The HR director nodded in understanding, already pulling up notes on her tablet. The assistant dabbed at her eyes again, moved by her boss's words. Even the manager's face showed a glimmer of something new, perhaps hope, perhaps understanding. Starting tomorrow, the owner continued, we're going to make some changes. Big changes. He looked each person in the eye as he spoke. And it starts with a simple truth that my grandfather taught me. Everyone has a story, and every story deserves to be heard. The rain outside had started to ease, and a patch of evening sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow across the conference room. In that moment, something shifted, not just in that room, but in the entire hotel. It was the beginning of a transformation that would touch countless lives, starting with the people in that very room. The next morning arrived with a fresh energy in the hotel. Word had spread quickly about what happened the previous evening, and the lobby buzzed with whispered conversations. The owner had called for an all-staff meeting, something that hadn't happened in years. By 9 a.m., the hotel's largest ballroom was filled with employees from every department, from housekeeping to management. Some sat nervously, others whispered among themselves. A young bellhop who had witnessed yesterday's scene was telling his coworkers about it for the 10th time. The cleaning staff, who usually stayed behind the scenes, sat in the front rows, looking both nervous and curious. Even the night shift workers had stayed back to attend. The owner walked in, now back in his usual business attire, but somehow different. More approachable, more human. The makeup was gone, but the experience had left an invisible mark on him. The manager from yesterday's incident sat in the front row, looking like he hadn't slept all night. Good morning, the owner began, his voice warm and clear. Yesterday, something happened in our hotel that changed my perspective forever. He paused, looking around the room. But before I talk about that, I want to hear from you. He pointed to an elderly housekeeper who had worked there for 20 years. Tell me, he said gently, have you ever felt invisible in this hotel? The woman hesitated, then slowly stood up. Her voice shook as she shared stories of guests who walked past her like she didn't exist, of being treated as part of the furniture rather than a person. Next, a young valet spoke about the assumptions people made about him based on his accent. A front desk clerk admitted to sometimes judging guests by their appearance, saying it out loud for the first time and looking ashamed. One by one, people began to share their experiences, their fears, their own biases. The manager who had caused yesterday's scene listened to every word, his face showing a mix of emotions, shame, understanding, and eventually, determination to change. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up with tears in his eyes. I've worked in hotels for 15 years, he said, his voice cracking. And yesterday was the first time I truly understood what it means to judge someone unfairly. I saw myself in the worst possible light, and I want to do better. I need to do better. The owner nodded encouragingly. That's exactly why we're all here. Not to point fingers or assign blame, but to learn and grow together. He walked through the aisles as he spoke, making eye contact with different staff members. From today, things will be different. He explained the changes that would begin immediately. Every employee would receive new training, not just about policies and procedures, but about understanding and empathy. They would learn about unconscious bias, about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, about seeing the person behind every face that walked through their doors. But more importantly, he continued, we're going to create a culture where everyone feels valued. Whether you're a guest staying in our most expensive suite, or someone walking in from the rain, whether you're the CEO of a company or part of our housekeeping team, Everyone deserves respect." The room fell silent as his words sank in. A maintenance worker wiped tears from his eyes. Two front desk clerks held hands, nodding in agreement. Even the skeptical-looking security guard in the back seemed moved. "This isn't just about business," the owner said, his voice full of emotion. "It's about being human. About remembering that each person who walks through those doors has a story, has dignity, has worth. Yesterday, I walked in my own hotel feeling worthless because of how I looked. Today, we start making sure no one ever feels that way again." As the meeting ended, people didn't rush out as usual. They stayed, talking to colleagues they'd never spoken with before, sharing stories, making connections. The manager approached the housekeeping staff, apologizing for times he might have overlooked them. Something was shifting in the hotel, like a fresh breeze blowing through a stuffy room. It was just the beginning of a bigger change, but you could feel it in the air: hope, understanding, and the promise of something better. The weeks following the incident brought remarkable changes to the hotel. The owner had turned the conference room into what he called the learning hub, where staff gathered daily for training sessions that felt more like family discussions than formal meetings. Today's session was particularly special. It was the manager's turn to share his story. Standing at the front of the room, the manager looked different from the man who had shown such prejudice that rainy evening. His usual crisp suit remained, but his demeanor had softened. "A month ago," he began, his voice quiet but steady, "I thought I knew everything about running a hotel. I was wrong. I knew nothing about what true hospitality means." The room was packed. Housekeepers sat next to executives, doormen beside accounting staff. Everyone leaned forward, drawn in by the raw honesty in his voice. Through the windows, sunshine streamed in, so different from the rain that had fallen on that transformative night. "Growing up, my family had money," he continued. "I never had to worry about being judged by my appearance. I never knew what it felt like to be unwelcome somewhere." He paused, collecting his thoughts. But that night, watching our owner reveal himself, seeing the look in his eyes, it broke something in me, and maybe that needed to break. An older bellhop nodded knowingly. Just last week, he had shared his own story of facing discrimination at previous jobs. These sessions had become a safe space where people could speak their truth without fear of judgment. The manager shared how he'd spent his weekends volunteering at a local homeless shelter, learning about the circumstances that can lead anyone to fall on hard times. "I met a former business executive there," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "He lost everything in a medical bankruptcy. He looked just like the man I tried to throw out of our lobby." The owner sat quietly in the back, watching his hotel staff transform into a real community. He noticed how the front desk clerk who used to avoid eye contact with cleaning staff now knew all their names and stories. How the security team had learned to approach situations with compassion first, force last. "Yesterday," the manager continued, "a man walked in looking lost and tired. A month ago, I would have called security." He smiled slightly. "Instead, I sat with him, got him some water, and listened. Turns out he was a business owner who had just lost his company. He could afford our best suite, but what he needed most was someone to treat him like a human being." The room was silent, every person deep in thought about their own journey over the past month. The owner's assistant wiped a tear from her eye. She'd been documenting all these stories, building a new training manual that would be used across all their hotels. The maintenance supervisor raised his hand to share. "Last week," he said, "I saw a guest making fun of one of our housekeeper's accents. Before all this, I would have stayed quiet. Instead, I politely explained that our staff speaks multiple languages and deserves respect. The guest actually apologized." Small victories like these had been happening throughout the hotel. The doorman who once judged people by their cars now greeted everyone with the same warm smile. The concierge who used to give better recommendations to well-dressed guests now treated everyone like VIPs. I've learned that luxury isn't just about marble floors and expensive furniture, the manager concluded. True luxury is treating every single person with dignity and respect. He looked around the room, making eye contact with his colleagues, no longer just coworkers, but partners in creating something special. The owner finally stood up. What happened that night was painful, he said, but look what grew from it. We're not just changing a hotel, we're changing lives, including our own. He gestured to the wall where they'd hung their new motto. Every guest, every story, every time. As the session ended, people lingered, sharing stories and ideas. A housekeeper was teaching executives phrases in her native language. The security team was discussing ways to make their presence feel more welcoming. The change wasn't just in policies or procedures, it was in hearts and minds. That's when everyone knew this wasn't just a training program. This was the beginning of a movement that would spread far beyond these hotel walls. 3 months had passed since that rainy night, and the changes in the hotel were nothing short of remarkable. The owner sat in his office, reviewing a stack of recent guest feedback cards with a smile on his face. The words welcoming, inclusive, and extraordinary service kept appearing, but it was the personal stories that touched his heart the most. One card read, "I'm a truck driver who saved up for years to give my wife our 25th anniversary dream stay. I was nervous walking in with my worn jeans, but your staff made us feel like royalty." Another shared, "As someone who uses a wheelchair, I've never felt so naturally accommodated. Your staff didn't treat me with pity or awkwardness, just genuine warmth." A knock on his door interrupted his reading. The manager entered, carrying a laptop and wearing an excited expression. "Sir, you need to see this," he said, opening the computer. "Our latest guest satisfaction scores are the highest they've ever been." But that's not even the best part. He turned the screen to show a viral social media post. A guest had shared their experience of watching the hotel staff help a homeless person during a snowstorm. Instead of turning them away, the night staff had provided warm coffee, called local shelters, and treated them with respect. The post had thousands of shares and comments. "This isn't just happening at our flagship location," the manager continued, scrolling through more reports. "All our hotels are showing similar improvements since we implemented the new training program." His voice carried the pride of someone who had been part of a genuine transformation. The owner stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below. He watched as the doorman greeted a family stepping out of a modest car with the same enthusiasm he showed to those arriving in luxury vehicles. A maintenance worker stopped to help an elderly guest with her bags, taking time to chat with her. "You know what's really interesting?" the manager said, joining him at the window. "Our high-end corporate clients are actually booking more events with us. They say it's because they can feel the authentic atmosphere. Turns out, treating everyone with dignity isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business." Just then, the HR director knocked and entered with more news. The hotel's new training program had caught the attention of the hospitality industry. Other hotel chains were reaching out, wanting to learn about their approach to inclusive service. Universities were asking to use their methods in hospitality courses. The owner smiled, remembering how it all started with a simple decision to see his hotel through different eyes. "Let's organize an industry conference," he suggested. "We can share what we've learned, but more importantly, we can learn from others too. This should be a conversation, not a lecture." The manager's eyes lit up. "Actually, sir, I had an idea about that." He pulled out a proposal he'd been working on. "What if we invited people from all walks of life to be guest speakers? Not just industry experts, but regular people who can share their experiences of feeling welcomed or unwelcomed in hotels." The HR director nodded enthusiastically. "And we could offer scholarships to hospitality students from underprivileged backgrounds," she added. "Show them that there's a place for everyone in this industry." As they discussed the plans, a commotion outside caught their attention. The staff was gathering in the lobby for their daily morning meeting. something that had once been a boring ritual but was now a cherished tradition. Through the glass walls of his office, the owner could see people from different departments chatting and laughing together, sharing stories and supporting each other. The morning sun streamed through the lobby's grand windows, casting a warm glow over the scene. The owner thought about how this light touched everyone equally: guests in designer suits and worn jackets, staff members from different backgrounds, everyone who walked through those doors. "You know," he said quietly, "when I put on those old clothes that night, I thought I was going to teach someone a lesson. Instead, we all learned something much more valuable." He picked up the stack of feedback cards, each one a testimony to the power of seeing people as people first. The manager nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. What had started as a moment of confrontation had grown into a movement of compassion, proving that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest shifts in perspective. 1 year had passed since that transformative rainy evening. The hotel lobby was buzzing with excitement as people gathered for a special celebration. Elegant banners hung from the ceiling, reading "1 year of change," every guest, every story. The space was filled with faces both familiar and new: hotel staff, industry leaders, community members, and guests who had been touched by the hotel's transformation. Near the grand staircase, the manager who had once shown such prejudice now stood greeting people with genuine warmth. He had become known throughout the hotel industry for speaking at conferences about his personal journey from bias to understanding. "My greatest mistake became my greatest lesson," he often said, and you could hear the truth in his voice. The owner watched from a quiet corner, taking in the scene. A group of housekeepers who had once stayed silent were now confidently chatting with hotel executives. A former homeless man who had been helped by the hotel was there too, now employed as part of their community outreach program, helping others find their feet. "Excuse me, sir," a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to see an elderly woman clutching a handwritten letter. "I was here that night," she said, "watching from the lobby when you revealed yourself. I've been following your hotel's story ever since." She handed him the letter. "This is from my granddaughter. Your story inspired her to study hospitality management. She wants to create places where everyone feels welcome." Before he could respond, the HR director called everyone's attention. It was time for the presentation of their year-long impact report. The lights dimmed slightly as images appeared on the large screen behind the podium. The numbers told an incredible story. Guest satisfaction scores had risen by 40%. Employee retention had reached an all-time high. Their training program had been adopted by 15 other hotel chains across the country. But it was the personal stories that brought tears to people's eyes. They showed video clips of real moments: a front desk clerk learning sign language to better serve deaf guests, a security guard who had helped reunite a lost child with their parents, housekeepers being invited to sit and share meals with guests who had learned their names and stories. The owner stepped up to speak, his voice filled with emotion. "A year ago, I thought I was going to teach one person a lesson about discrimination. Instead, we all learned something much more valuable." He paused, looking around the room. "We learned that true luxury isn't about marble floors or crystal chandeliers. It's about making every person feel seen, heard, and valued." He pointed to the wall where they'd hung photos of their community heroes, regular guests who had touched their lives. There was the truck driver and his wife celebrating their anniversary, the wheelchair user who had become a regular guest, the business owner who had lost everything but found compassion within these walls. "But our work isn't finished," he continued. "This is just the beginning." He announced their new initiative, a foundation to help other hotels and businesses create truly inclusive environments. They would offer scholarships, training programs, and support for people from all backgrounds to enter the hospitality industry. The manager stepped forward then, standing beside his boss. "A year ago, I was the problem," he said honestly. "Today, I'm part of the solution. And I've learned that change isn't just possible, it's necessary." His words resonated through the quiet room. As the formal presentation ended, people mingled and shared stories. A young bellhop was excitedly telling new employees about the night that started it all. The maintenance supervisor was showing photos of the community garden they'd started on the hotel's rooftop, where staff and guests now grew vegetables together. The owner found himself back at the spot where he had stood that rainy night, looking at his reflection in the marble floor. The hotel was different now. Warmer, more human. But more importantly, the people within it were different. They had learned to see beyond appearances, to find the dignity in every person who walked through those doors. As the evening drew to a close, a new guest walked in from the rain, looking tired and uncertain, just as he had a year ago. Without hesitation, 3 staff members moved to welcome them, their genuine smiles reflecting the simple truth they had all learned, that every person has a story worth hearing, and every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. In that moment, watching his hotel in action, the owner knew that sometimes the greatest changes come not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of human kindness repeated day after day until they become a way of life.